This podcast is called The State of It, and you don't get many more failures of the state that are as big as this.
And this, I think, will be the first real test of how he handles adversity. I suspect he won't be able to do it with a TikTok video.
Welcome to this week's episode of The State of It. Today we're going to be talking about two things. We are going to be talking about the monster autumn that is to come. There are three particularly big things on the horizon. The early release of thousands of very dangerous prisoners and the issues around that. That's number one. Number two is the budget, which is potentially a tax-raising budget. Big problems around that. And number three, we're going to be talking to you about welfare. And then on top of that, we're going to also talk about Reform UK as various splits are now opening up in the public from within the party. Let's kick off with the autumn. And if we just start by talking about the early release scheme, they think they found a solution for it. They are going to stop certain offenders who have committed a type of manslaughter from being released from prison. And why does that matter? It's because for Andy Burnham, his biggest concern at the moment is stopping the release of PC Andrew Harper's killers. And this would appear to do that. But it's a can of worms, because if you provide one exemption, it then creates issues around why there isn't another exemption. So in this case, they're going to stop the release of everyone that's done what's called unlawful act of manslaughter. And that means that you've committed a criminal act that does harm to others, and that covers the PC Harper case. So it's not enough for murder, but it was harming others while committing a criminal act. And in this case, obviously, PC Harper died. So that would do for that. But then we've had lots of people already today get in touch, domestic violence charities and others. You're going to get a wave of domestic abusers that are released, killers, people that have killed their spouses and their partners. And I guess that is the point of this early release story. It is a Hobson's choice. There is no good choice. Whatever Andy Burnham does, it's going to be really difficult to manage. And come the autumn, he has to come up with a solution in Parliament in September, and then they start getting released from October. And that is an almost impossible line to tread.
I think of all the kind of bad legacies that the last Conservative government left to Labour, this is prison is the one that's always going to be most problematic. I mean, there aren't the spaces. You do need to do the early release. Nobody wants to. And it's one of these things where each individual person released is his or her own horror story. They've got the victims, you've got the crimes, you've got what will strike the electorate as a bizarre situation where the Prime Minister doesn't want it to happen, but still it happens. Now, there are lots of reasons why that's the case, but it just makes the Prime Minister look impotent. And of course, Andy Burnham, it hasn't got much, or not very long, to say to voters, look, I'm different, I can make things happen. Now, of course, I think this is down to bad legal weeding. I mean, they should have been sorted out. In my view, the Home Secretary should have the power to veto any specific early release if they want to. But to do that, you need to change a law. The last government didn't change the law. This government hasn't changed that law. I think that law should be done for exactly these reasons. But until it is passed, then there isn't anything the Prime Minister can do. And Burnham was told, when he was given various options, they're all bad in various forms. He chose this particular bad option, knowing what it would bring. And this, I think, will be the first real test of how he handles adversity. I suspect he won't be able to do it with a TikTok video.
I think that it's been remarked upon fair amount that Burnham seems to enjoy the act of being Prime Minister, which nobody could have accused his predecessor of. And this is just one of those really kind of big questions of leadership, where there is the legal architecture of the Ministry of Justice, the requirement, as Fraser outlined, to change legislation if you do want to be able to summarily exempt people from this policy. And then there's just a finite period of time, and the question of what he can do. And he's not made himself hostage to fortune. He's outlined what he wishes to do. He's told his Justice Secretary, you must resolve this. And I think whereas from time to time, Starmer almost looked happy to be imprisoned by questions of law and process, Burnham has here said, no, I'm aware of the process and I'm demanding that we find a way out of it. And his ability to do that, by the way, in relation to early releases, will be quite an interesting test of his broader kind of fleet-footedness. Can you, as Prime Minister, use your imagination and relationships with the system to come up with some act of escapology that gets you to where you want to get with the electorate?
I mean, this podcast is called The State of It, and you don't get many more failures of the state that are as big as this. And that is a failure that crosses successive governments, and it is falling now on Andy Burnham's watch. And I think his strategy is basically to try to show the public, look, I am on your side. I am trying to stop the release of dangerous people. But exactly as you say, Fraser, the moment that someone is released and goes on to reoffend, goes on to kill or assault someone again, then that story kind of gathers energy and wind again. And it's just a big problem. But on the other side of the ledger, you've also got the police. The police have written a letter, 50 police constables, chief constables, have come together and written to warn of effectively the risk to public safety, that if they get this wrong and they release the wrong people, that it's not something the police can easily manage. And we've heard this again and again from Mark Rowley, the head of the Met Police. He is making the case of, look, you're basically giving us dangerous people to manage on the street. And, you know, it's a very clear example of state failure, I think.
Well, I think it's something slightly different. I would call it the question of state capacity. And I think this is the problem in Britain, in America, and right around the Western world, that people vote for leaders to do something, then the leaders don't do it, but the leaders don't really admit that's because they don't have the power. Now, I think, Gabriel, you're completely right. Keir Starmer almost loved not having the power. He's like, look, I can't do it because the ECHR won't let me, this architecture won't let me. He seemed to love the idea of politicians being captive to this higher, almost ecclesiastical authority of human rights and what have you. Now, I think that is what's giving rise to populism, because voters do want change and they find out that so much power has been sent away from elected office and towards these various treaties and laws that bind the hands of ministers, that the ministers can't do what they're elected to do. Now, I always thought that there should be a great legal reform act, that Starmer, because he was a lawyer, was perfectly placed to say, you know, I'm going to change all of this. I'm going to give the power back into people you elect, so the Prime Minister can do what he tells people he will do. If he wants something to be built, then that thing can be built. But of course, Starmer was the Gollum of the legal underworld here. I mean, he was never going to come after his own warrants. Now, one of the great things about Andy Burnham is he's not a Blairite, he's not a Starmerite, he's not from any of these worlds. He could actually, now that Lord Hermer's gone, say, okay, this is a great example of why government needs to be rewired. I'm the Prime Minister, I want to stop this, I can't stop it because of various laws, so I'm going to now look at this wider problem of state capacity, and I'm going to find out what we need to do, for example, to stop the boats. I mean, the reason that people are coming in small boats isn't because the Coast Guard can't bat them away, it's because of a network of laws obliges us to meet them at the border, to receive them, to escort them to the various centres. Until you change the laws, you won't change the small boats. Starmer was never going to change those laws, even when David Blunkett and Jack Straw were urging him to. Perhaps Andy Burnham will. Perhaps this will be his first taste with the problem of state capacity. So I'd love to think this is a way of vaccinating him from further mistakes, and he does move towards the legal weeding that Keir Starmer and Lord Hermer would not do.
Right, let's move from one seemingly intractable problem to another one, the budget and the public finances more broadly and the issues around those. So I'm going to kick off by just telling you what Andy Burnham would like this budget to do and to look like. So they need to find some money, but they're hoping that they won't need massive tax rises. That there's a massive asterisk on that with a disclaimer that we will go into shortly, because it does look like they will need some quite chunky tax rises. But either way, they're hoping it will be a, open quotes, streamlined affair, and the centrepiece of it will be devolution. So they want to announce the kind of fiscal measures for devolution so that local areas can raise and keep more of their own money. That's what they want people to talk about. But given the state of the public finances, given the impact of the Iran war, that question of how you find the money is going to dominate. And what they do, whether they go for capital gains tax. But yeah, that is my kind of kick-off on the budget.
And I wonder how much of this is going to be an excuse to get the tax-raising pain over to the local authorities rather than central government. Now, as a Scot, I've heard this before. Let's give power to the regions, etc.
It always works, doesn't it?
If you look at Wales, look at Scotland, and you find out why this kind of, they're not really giving power back to the people, they're just giving it to bureaucrats, usually less effective ones. And the results in Scotland and Wales have not been good. The schools and hospitals in the two devolved countries are not better. And it's been really a sort of a disappointment, and in some cases a calamity. So that's why I think he might struggle to sell this as empowering people. Now, if you want to empower people, you do what David Milburn used to describe as double devolution. You give them power not just to the local authority, but to the actual individual. You let them spend more of their own money. You give them choice in education. You give them choice in health. That's how you empower communities. If you're going to empower a town hall, and by the way, empower it to raise lots of taxes that you don't dare to do yourself, that's something rather different.
But they do. I mean, they need money, right? So if we look at the sums, they need 4.7 billion for defence. That was one of Keir Starmer's legacies. They need, I think I've counted about 2 billion of the 4 billion of pledges that Burnham has made alone so far look unfunded to me. So that money's got to come from somewhere. And that's with no sign of the Strait of Hormuz opening, continuing conflict in the Middle East. The problems and the financial pressures are piling up, Gabriel.
I don't think it's fair to say that all politicians have espoused the same message. We actually live in a time where there is a sort of marked distinction between what, say, Reform and Labour and the Tories are proposing. But there is an extent to which the successive governments have all alighted on this sweet spot, which is that people feel they want control restored to their lives. They want control over their finances, and people want control within their communities. And Burnham's basically saying to people, this time I've actually got the secret sauce to give you a greater actual autonomy over your postcode. He talks about good growth in every postcode, greater and also greater perceived ownership as well. And has just a really straightforward question, which is, will the fact and the policy reality be commensurate with the rhetoric? Because the rhetoric is pretty soaring at the moment. And also, I mean, this is the essential question. It's so, I feel like an under-remarked upon, under-examined question. What exactly is it about this that will be distinct from the misadventures in devolution that have defined the Welsh and Scottish experiments over the last 30 years? I wouldn't say that he's been as forthcoming about that.
We expect him to talk today about public control. One of the big messages, they've taken public control of a relatively small local bus company. But Andy Burnham's bigger point is public control over the kind of everyday essentials, as he calls it. The big one on the horizon is Thames Water. And I think it is more complicated when you get to things like that because, okay, let's take Thames Water. You take that into special administration, which is something successive governments, it's a badly run company, it's too big, it doesn't serve people's interests well, that's fine. But once you get it into special administration, how do you get it back out again? The taxpayer subsidies to keep it operating would be huge. And then on top of that, you'd still have to keep paying all these executives quite chunky sums of money and bonuses to keep them on board. So it's not straightforward. And then who would the private buyer for a distressed asset be at the end of it? So that's one of the challenges here, that actually it's the gap between the ideas and the complexity of the reality, which I think we'll see in the autumn.
But I suppose that Andy Burnham is a man who needs to give a narrative right now. And he's the mayor who believes in giving power to local authorities. So, whether it works or not, it kind of sounds coherent. So he can say, look, if you dislike government, it's actually Westminster you dislike. And I intend to disempower what you don't like, which is government. So he wants to put a little rebel yell behind his devolution. So if he wants to be seen to be somebody who's making a big change, I think that's the big test for Andy Burnham. If you're fed up with a Labour government, if you're fed up with the way things are going, you want to believe somebody's coming along who's going to make a big change. And if he's saying, look, I'm going to completely redo the way government is done, I'm going to give power to the regions, it may or may not work, but at least it sounds like a change. So politically, I think it meets a lot of the tests he's got for himself. Whether it'll work in practice, well, ask anybody in Wales and Scotland.
Look, voters will need to see evidence of the change. And that brings us to the third topic in an absolutely terrible segue. Fraser, you have written the book on this. You spend an inordinate amount of your time buried deep in the welfare statistics on the government websites and elsewhere. But just very briefly, just to tee it up, we've got two big reviews which are coming at the same time. The Alan Milburn review into welfare, and he's looking at NEETs, so young people that are not in education, training or employment. And then on top of that, you've got a Stephen Timms review into PIP, which is the main disability benefit. So those are the two reviews. And at the end of it, Andy Burnham has talked a good game. He said he wants to cut the welfare bill. He said we shouldn't be squeamish about it. But what he said he's opposed to is crude cuts. Alan Milburn's interim report said that for every £25 spent on benefits, £1 is spent on employment support, right? And that is obviously an insane disparity. But to address that disparity, you can't just chuck money at the employment to level it up to 25. There are going to be winners and losers. And that is the difficult bit for Labour. That's the difficult bit for Burnham. Does he have the political will to address potential losers in the system?
I'm quite optimistic about his chances of getting this right, and I'll tell you why. The first is that he saw what failure looks like. He saw Keir Starmer thinking, look, a huge majority here, I can reform welfare. It was a debacle because he didn't have a narrative. You need to be able to say to people, look, this is tough love for a purpose. I'm going to take away this, it's going to hurt, but you and your community are going to be better off because of X, Y, and Z. I think that Andy Burnham has looked at this and he's realised, no, we need to start with the bigger picture, the bigger story. Now that, of course, to Starmer's credit, is why he commissioned Alan Milburn, why Pat McFadden's there and still in office, why Stephen Sims is there, so they can come up with the normal political narrative. First of all, to explain the nature of the crisis. I think welfare is the biggest crisis in Britain today. It's behind low economic growth, it's behind poverty, and it needs to be fixed from a progressive point of view. And I also think that Milburn has done something quite incredible. He's managed to bring all parties with him. So when his interim review came out, it wasn't a kind of, this is a Labour review to say how evil the Tories are. It was, look, we've all, as a country, we have got this needs problem we can all agree needs to be fixed. So I think we are heading towards a very rare historical moment where we could be able to get cross-party belief in welfare reform. And I can see the potential for a cross-party, but is needed because, of course, it's difficult for one person to make reforms while being accused of being cruel by the other person. They need to almost do disarmament, as it were. And so I do think that Andy Burnham, if you look at what he's done in Manchester, he was very good at working out the need for vocational education, of trying to integrate what he called the Manchester baccalaureate, trying to get people in work experience. He was also coming up against Bridget Phillipson wanting to centralise those things. So I think he gets it. I think he's going to want Burnham to go quite far, and we use Burnham as cover. And I think the Conservatives realise that they need to support this too. And surprisingly, Reform have been first out of the gates with their quite dramatic proposals for cutting disability allowances. So we could be heading for a moment here where there is a solution that it could work. It will be painful. I don't think it will save masses of money. But I think we've been crying out for it for many, many years. And I'm hopeful we'll get it before Christmas.
It's a tough sell with Labour MPs, though, Gabriel. They are a tough crowd on this, right?
I think if you look at the sort of mood music of the first, say, couple of months of Burnhamism, what has he prioritised in his messaging and language? Well, firstly, he has solidified publicly Labour's support to its, the bits of the electorate to Labour's left flank. And then within the Parliamentary Labour Party too, his whole leadership pitch was designed to bring back that kind of kingmaker coalition of the dispossessed, disgruntled, soft lefties. Burnham now has the quite unenviable, kind of complicated, fascinating task of saying to them, well, having given you a lot of love now, you need to come with me and accept that for us to survive and thrive, I need to make decisions that are difficult. They're going to be difficult for you in your constituency surgeries. And the essential question is, can Andy Burnham find a language that allows these people to rebut those claims as well? Because what it really felt like last time was because there was so little argumentation and forethought that went into, say, the winter fuel or benefits reform. I think that you've said there's cross-party support, but that doesn't mean that anybody is deluding themselves. It's going to be straightforward. And, we were talking about early releases and the extent to which every single data point and case study is a person's life and universe, or, every single instance of something happening becomes an emotionally unignorable and devastating example of the effect of this. It will be not dissimilar where you look at people whose lives are wholly contingent, or they perceive them to be dependent on the existing flow of money and support from the state. What is Andy Burnham's rejoinder to them? You can't ignore it. So how do you deal with it? How does the Labour Party deal with it? That is kind of one of the big essay questions for the budget and for welfare reform when it inevitably comes.
And that essay question is, what is the Labour Party for? What does it mean to be progressive? The clue is in the name. Let's go back to Keir Hardie. Let's look at the whole purpose of working. If this party believes that work should be a way out of poverty, it needs to repair the economy, so it is. So I think it's actually, in some ways, it's a difficult argument to make because difficult reforms. In other ways, it ought to be easy. This should be in the soul of every single progressive MP. They can blame the Tories as much as they like, but if you've got a situation right now where we've got the highest number of NEETs of any European country apart from Romania, if you've got a situation where we're breeding now a new form of poverty, a new inequality, and you can see it in the drugs deaths, from the alcohol deaths, you can see it in the welfare ghettos that we're kind of creating unintentionally, this is not a progressive outcome. This will be, to me, the biggest test of Andy Burnham, but I also believe he can do it. He's a good storyteller, we know that. But, I think this is wrongly diminished storytelling. I've always thought about politics as ultimately it's making and winning arguments. And if he can do that with his own party, he could be an historic change-making prime minister. And perhaps this is something you could even fight an election on. It'd be difficult, but this is the challenge.
We're going to head to the interval, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about Nigel Farage and Reform UK and some of the infighting that we've seen in the wake of the Clacton by-election. Welcome back to The State of It, the political podcast from The Times and The Sunday Times. We want to talk to you about Reform UK. Now, we have not seen Nigel Farage now since, I think, 3 a.m. on Friday, when he was on Farage Fest and he took to the stage and he kind of said this victory in the Clacton by-election sticks 2 fingers up at the establishment. And since then, he's gone quiet. We've seen a kind of extraordinary internal row in the party over Zia Yusuf, the party's Home Affairs spokesman, which seems to have culminated in Tim Montgomery, who's a broadcaster, a former Tory and a supporter of Farage and Reform. He's been suspended for being possibly too much of a critical friend. Is that fair, Fraser?
It seems to be, and suspended as a party member. Now, it's one thing to sack a minister or a frontbencher for being critical of the leader. It's another thing to kick somebody out of your party because they went on television as a supporter saying, I'm not quite sure that Nigel Farage did the right thing in not giving a victory speech after Clacton, So it seems a relatively small offence and a very strange precedent, but this is an unusual party. When Tim Montgomery was signed as a member of Reform, that was enough for a sort of Farage press conference. It was a big deal. Tim Montgomery's been an intellectual force behind conservatism, there's no doubt about that, the founder of Conservative Home. And when he moved across, it was a prelude to Robert Jenrick moving across. He had a big hand in taking Jenrick across as well. So it seemed to be a kind of a shift in the right. Now, by the same token, his expulsion or suspension from the party is also quite a big event. And it seems to have come over Zia Yusuf. Now, Zia Yusuf, we know, basically loathes Robert Jenrick and vice versa. Zia was calling Jenrick a traitor before he joined Reform. But when Tim Montgomery went public in saying, look, Zia Yusuf is becoming too divisive, and what Zia is doing in calling people traitors is galvanising the anti-reform tactical vote. It used to be said in politics, but it doesn't matter how much those who don't vote for you don't like you. In other words, let them hate us as much as they like. But that's not true if anti-reform becomes the number one force in a constituency. If you get Tories voting for Labour and vice versa, because their number one priority is that reform stays out. Now, Tim Montgomery and many people like him thought that Zia Yusuf was doing exactly that he was coming up with this sort of vicious authoritarian language. I'm going to open a detention centre in the constituencies of people who don't vote for reform. I'm going to track down and boot out up to 2 million undocumented people in Britain. I'm going to bring a British ICE to the UK. Now, a lot of people thought this is just too much. It may galvanise the base, but it's going to make other people vote tactically against it. Tim Montgomery voiced the concerns that many in Reform have got, and for that he seems to have lost his privileges as a Reform member.
It's also just these inherent tension within Reform. I mean, one of the points that Zia Yusuf made before Robert Jenrick's defection, he didn't want any more Tories. He wanted them to be their own thing. So you've since obviously had Robert Jenrick, Suella Braverman, lots of different Tories joining. And so unsurprisingly, they're not particularly happy bedfellows.
That's right. I mean, I think what's so interesting about this is we don't yet know exactly why this has happened. So let's be clear that party leaders routinely use the machinery of their party bureaucracy to display their own political direction. Alistair Campbell was suspended under Corbyn's Labour. Corbyn was suspended under Starmer's. Kemi Badenoch at the moment has drawn some criticism for forestalling the parliamentary selection of some former Tory cabinet members. So it is normal for party leaders to exercise their discretion and use the party rulebook to do certain things and promote or demote certain individuals. But the question here is, what is actually going on? Is this merely a kind of tactical response to Montgomery's it's not that he's been insubordinate per se. He's just been really candid. He's tweeted and now spoken on The Spectator with a degree of honesty about what he perceives to be the problem with the party, and in particular Zia's pronouncements. Or in time, will it emerge that Farage is using this to convey that he's in the same intellectual position as Zia, that he doesn't want to unite the right, that he objects to this notion that in some way or another, informally or otherwise, the constituent parts of the British right will need to unite in order to prevent progressive domination at the next election. I mean, that's kind of the massive electoral question, the kind of tectonic plate on which this latest soap opera sits. And I would say as well, there's just a massive question as to what Zia's long game over here, because if you woke up every day wanting to succeed Nigel Farage, you would probably say things and act in a way that is consistent with Zia Yusuf of late. I mean, everything he says is catnip to the kind of die-hard reform base, but it is not necessarily the path you would chart if your objective was, as you say, Fraser, firstly, making reform a more benign and palatable proposition for people who are swing voters, or who you might say we just rather they were quiescent come the next election. As long as they're not going out to vote against us, that would be good. Also, it's not as straightforward as just the Tory defectors are arraying themselves against Zia Yusuf. There are a lot of people who have known Farage for a long time who have long had an issue with his own conduct and performance. I know on very good authority a man who's now no stranger to our readers, George Cottrell, kind of one of the few Farage whisperers who's been there throughout the last decade, has major issues with Yusuf, and for a long time felt that he was detracting from Farage's operation. So this man at the moment in his fate, Yusuf, is once again of the essence, really. It's fascinating. And it's not exactly clear where Farage lies on it either.
Comes down to a bandwidth issue, right? Farage wants, and Reform surely want to be doing what Robert Jenrick did yesterday. They want to do press conferences where they're talking about stripping foreigners of welfare. They want to be playing to what they see as their strengths on migration, on crime. And instead, there was a story today about internal fighting, the soap opera, as you call it, Gabriel, the kind of soap opera that ultimately derailed the Tories. And that's what they've got to watch here, that there is going to be a need to assert some kind of discipline, because if they don't and the fighting continues, then that becomes the story. And we haven't even got to, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but Insight's work on Reform's finances and all the distraction from their core message that presents. But that's the issue here, isn't it? It's probably not the ground they want to be talking on.
And also, it was never clear if Zia Yusuf is controllable, as it were. He's got his own people, he's got his own team. He will, launch a policy in the morning and then pick a fight with somebody on Twitter in the afternoon. And his sort of side hustle, as it were, can create more fuss than the original policy. He seems to enjoy conflict quite a lot. And by the way, he's also defied Nigel Farage. Farage was saying time and time again, no, we cannot have mass deportation. It's impractical. We can't kick out every single legal immigrant, man, woman and child. It's just not politically workable. And then Zia Yusuf seems to have won the argument, saying, no, that's exactly what we are going to do. It was never clear to me how they were reconciled. But when he resigned, I mean, Zia Yusuf is quite a flouncer outer. He resigned as party chairman. He's resigned as head of the Doge unit. The first time he resigned, Nigel Farage did everything he could to bring him back. He was really saying, look, we need you as a party, come back. I think he recognises that his strengths is he is a very good media performer. But this is also a question as to how they handle Restore. Restore is the great phantom at the Reform feast right now, because it's got exactly the same playbook. We want to be the baddest guys in town. We're going to appeal to you. We're going to be an even bigger vote of protest than Reform is. And Zia Yusuf has been saying, look, we can't allow them that advantage. So we need to be saying shock and awe things that do not give Rupert Lowe that kind of edge. Nigel Farage hasn't been so clear about that. So this is another point of differentiation. How do Reform respond to Restore? Zia Yusuf's answer has been to be right out there of the traps, setting off explosions left, right and centre, denying Restore oxygen. Farage hasn't been so sure about this. So now we see a situation where Farage's popularity is falling quite a lot. His approval rating is now down there with Zach Polanski, where Kemi Badenoch is just above water on 0.3, and Andy Burnham was on 0.6 and 7. Farage is minus 23. This isn't a great place. And if he were to go, I mean, I don't think he will, but if he were, Then Lord Ashcroft polling says Yusuf's number 1 to succeed him, and then maybe Richard Tice number 2 and Jedrick number 3. But you wonder how much of Yusuf's activity is directed at the reform base rather than the reform target voters.
Can I get just one thing that I know you've done, Fraser? Because obviously there is a degree to which the version that Zia, of himself Zia presents on social media is slightly a caricature. The traitor language, it's a hard line, kind of picking fights with people, that kind of thing. You've sat down and debated with him. And that is a very different Zia that I saw during that debate, unless I've misread it.
No, yeah, absolutely. I found him thoughtful. I was chatting to him after it as well, quite sociable.
It was a measured debate, wasn't it? You were debating...
we were debating, is Britain broken? The kind of classic kind of fault line between the Conservatives and Reform right now. And, I agreed with them on a whole bunch of things. But what was interesting was that when I was there in person with him, he was friendly, chatty, saying, yes, I think you might have exaggerated this, but I think we agree on that. The kind of language which you don't do for online. Now, the thing is, Steve, you'll know, all of us know, but there are politicians whose online persona is very different to what they are in person. And I think Zia is like that. I think he's a man of exceptional ability, exceptional energy. And I think he's right in a whole bunch of things that he says. But he's also probably thinking that nowadays you need to create a reaction. You need to be creating a fire left, right and centre if you want to keep the kind of narrative behind you.
And Gabriel, look, we just want to talk about Insight and the work that you've done on the Farage and Cottrell and the donations issue, basically, because this issue isn't going away. Standards investigation is going to continue, and it's going to continue to be a distraction, I think. It's a broad question, but I was trying to grapple with it the other day. Why is it that Reform attracts these kind of stories? It's because it's very unusual the source of their money, isn't it? It's not something we've seen in British politics before.
Yeah, well, I think the most kind of eloquent and I should say prescient commentator on this has been Fraser, who identified some time ago that what we were witnessing with respect to the funding of Reform was unprecedented, and the role of crypto in relation to the funding of Farage personally and his party. So I suppose what we've been doing at Insight, the Sunday Times investigations team, for over the last month or so, we've been trying to examine, I suppose, sort of, there have been two horses riding in parallel to one another. One is the kind of more technical, some people might say, slightly more Westminstery question of Farage's adherence to party rules. And then the other is we've been trying to unravel this amazingly opaque world of offshore crypto gambling, payment processing companies, the ways in which individuals are capable of moving money around the world, and in turn, the ways in which that money then has fortified Farage since his return to politics. And I suppose the bits where this story has become troubling for Farage are where those two themes, two threads have come together. I think the best example of that, and I sort of doff my cap here to The Guardian, who've done very important reporting on this as well, is the question of this police investigation and the donations by Fiona Cottrell, George Cottrell's mother. So she donated £1 million to a UK company of which Richard Tice was beneficiary, who then donated half to Reform around the time of the last election. The whereabouts of the remaining £500,000 Tice has never provided clarity on. Cottrell's mum, who it later emerged had received money from Cottrell shortly before making the donations, had wired money to Tice with the assistance of an Australian payments processing company called Oneify. We then at Insight had a source who approached us and were able to determine that Cottrell himself had taken out a account with this Australian entity 24 hours before his mother used it to make donations. And we found out that all the people involved in the company had met Cottrell at a party in Montenegro a year or two prior. So this story, I mean, what's kind of fascinating about it journalistically is that it is so tightly socially wired. There are essentially about 10 people encompass the worlds of politics, crypto, gambling, and they're all intimately involved. And just to kind of lift the veil a little bit into our journalistic process, we had a story on the weekend about the fact that Christopher Harborne, the man behind the £5 million, he owns a company which this offshore gambling platform to which Cottrell's connected, Tether, used to process gambling payments with respect to UK customers. And we were in receipt of two pieces of information. One somebody came to us and started giving us information about Harborne's acquisition of this payments company, IFX, for which Farage's personal lawyer received a £1 million finder's fee. He brought it to Harborne's attention a few years ago and seems to have done reasonably well out of it. And Harborne's since used it. It's a foreign exchange payments company. We were learning all about that. Entirely separately, somebody gave us some actual documentary correspondence showing that UK customers were being invited to bet with this offshore gambling company. And we were given some banking information where UK customers were told to send their funds. And it was one of those moments where, you know, journalism, it just all clicked. I said to my colleague, Phoenicia, what do we think, what will happen if we type in the account number and sort code? Like I just said, I just have a weird feeling that IFX payments is going to come up. And we typed in on Revolut and on a few other electronic payments providers the account information. And it was slightly filmic when IFX payments just emerged on screen. But I guess the reason I assumed that Harborne would be involved in the financial infrastructure behind this gambling syndicate was that there is just a tiny number of people involved in all of this. And they're all people to whom Farage is incredibly close. Farage dined with Harborne and George Cottrell days before the launch of Tether.bet. So it is really the story of, you know, journalism is sort of at its most intelligible and hopefully most compelling where there are actual people as well as big forces at play. And this is a story of big forces, crypto, gambling, offshore payments, politics, money, but also basically a group of people who you could fit in a room who all know each other very intimately. And I suppose that's what we've been trying to unravel recently. Farage says that Cottrell's support for him is none of anybody's business and has nothing to do with politics. George Cottrell says he is a customer in Tether.bet and has no further role. Christopher Harborne said he was not involved in the day-to-day arrangements of IFX. Richard Tice denies all wrongdoing.
I think that brings this week's episode to a close. So thank you everyone for listening. Gabriel, because you're here so rarely now, could you do the honours and thank our amazing producers?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much to Molly, you and Harry for your amazing, elegant... I get to watch their brilliance from afar now. And yeah, it's very nice to be back. So thank you so much for making the episode sing.